Hello, everyone. My name is Zachary Strong. I am an engineering physics graduate and biblical scholar. And today we are going to be examining the topic of good and evil. Specifically, we're going to be looking at why good always seems to win out in the end and why evil always seems to stumble and fall eventually. Okay, when you look at, human history, there have always been tyrants and evil regimes and so on. But as time goes on, those evil regimes seem to, stumble and fall apart. And after some investigation into the matter, I think I've been able to deduce why that is. And as far as I can tell, it's written into the laws of physics. So today we're going to be looking first at entropy, which is associated with disorder and chaos. We're going to be looking at social entropy, which is a concept that I might have invented. I don't know for sure, but we're going to be looking at social entropy. We're going to be examining how evil creates social entropy. And finally, I'll be, offering some comments on the instability of evil. So, as I mentioned, it really does seem that the collapse of evil is something that's written into the laws of physics and written into human nature. And, I'm hoping to be able to show you in 20 minutes or less why that's the case. So let's just jump right into it. Entropy, disorder, and chaos. Okay, so you might have heard of entropy before. Basically, it's a scientific concept that measures the amount of disorder, randomness, or uncertainty within a system. So, with the picture that I have on the screen, on the left is high entropy. Everything is kind of random, disorganized, and so on. And on the right, you have low entropy, where everything is organized and cohesive and so on. Okay, so entropy, very simply, is disorder, chaos, things breaking down, things not working, and so on. Okay? Now, a key equation that has to do with entropy is called the Gibbs free energy equation. And so on the screen I have the equation. It's delta G equals delta H minus T delta S, which is basically the available energy to do useful work is equal to the total energy minus the entropy. Okay, and what I've done is I've rearranged the terms of the equation, which I have on the screen. And basically, total energy is equal to useful energy plus entropy, or in other words, total energy is equal to order and chaos. Okay, ordered energy plus chaotic entropic energy, add those together, you have the total energy. Okay, which I think should make intuitive sense. Okay, if you have 100 joules of energy and 50 of those are entropy, then you have 50 joules left for useful work. Okay, so that's essentially, the Gibbs free energy equation. Okay, now, when you think about this, right, what this equation, at least the type that I've restated here, okay, you either have a choice between order and chaos. Okay, there's kind of a wedge point. I've talked about this in some of my other videos, but you kind of have this ongoing tug of war, in a way, between order and chaos. And this tug of war between ordered energy and chaotic energy is kind of what seems to drive the fact that evil always fails, always loses. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about social entropy really quickly. And again, I think this is a concept I might have invented, kind of. I'm sure someone else has come up with it. I just haven't seen it. But basically, back in 1948, some folks at Bell Labs realized that information functions basically the exact same way as entropy. Okay, so entropy is also not just disorder, but surprise. Okay, entropy is also surprise. Because if something is random, or entropic, it also is surprising. Okay, so the more surprising an event is, the more information it carries. Okay, so let me repeat. The more surprising an event is, the more random and disordered it is, the more information it has. Okay, so information and entropy, very closely linked, if not the same thing. Now, when it comes to human systems and social systems, okay, our brains are basically computers that process information. Okay, and as it turns out, sensory inputs like sight and sound and so on, those are just information. And neuroscientists have figured out that our brain is basically a computer which takes information from the senses and does computations on it. And they've also discovered, specifically someone named Carl Friston has discovered that the useful information to do mental computations is equal to the expected outcome versus minus essentially the entropy. It's very, very, very similar to the Gibbs free energy equation. Okay, it's very, very similar. So our brains essentially try to minimize surprise and therefore minimize entropy. Okay, we don't like getting surprised, okay, because surprises are usually a bad thing. But surprises also contain a lot of information, so there's sometimes an upside. Okay, now here's where social entropy comes in, okay, or this concept that I've created. In social environments, when a human being does something troublesome or unexpected, it creates more surprise, more entropy, than if they were behaving harmoniously. Therefore, a chaotic or disordered society contains a lot of entropy, and a harmonious or well-ordered society contains less entropy. So a practical understanding of this is that if a social group has a lot of conflict, disorder, or confusion, members of that group have to process more information in order to function socially. Okay, so if you are living in Southside Chicago, okay, where there's always lots of surprises, right? If you're living in Southside Chicago, you're going to have to work a lot harder just to exist than if you were living in, a very well-ordered, small town or something like that. Okay? So what I'm trying to get at with this is that the more disordered a society is, the more entropy there is, okay, and therefore the more breakdowns and chaos and so on there is. Okay? Now you might be wondering, how does this relate to good and evil? How does this relate to good and evil? And that's where we get to how evil creates social entropy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer you two practical examples, one at kind of an individual level, and then one at the level of a country or a nation. So the individual example is as follows. Let's say two people get into an argument at a bar, and one of them pulls out a gun and shoots the other person. Okay, this creates a lot of disorder and a lot of chaos. Okay, so the victim's family has to grieve their loved one, which is a whole bunch of chaos for them. The police have to launch an investigation, which is a whole bunch of chaos. Some of the witnesses at the bar probably need to go to therapy for PTSD, which is more chaos. People feel less safe in that neighborhood, which is chaos, order, disorder, entropy. Okay? And then the murderer has to take all kinds of self-protective actions to avoid getting arrested, which creates entropy in their own life. Okay, so through our human choices, we can either create order or entropy, order or chaos. Okay, and in this example, pulling out a gun and shooting someone at a bar creates a lot of chaos for everyone involved and everyone even around you in the area. Okay? And so as you can imagine, someone who decides to do such a thing, they're creating chaos for everyone else, they're creating chaos for themselves, and it's not a good course of action. Okay, which is at an individual level, it's why evil doesn't really work out. Okay, like people talk about karma and so on, but really, if you are an evil, nasty person or whatever, Okay, you're going to be creating chaos in your own life. And you're going to be creating chaos for other people, and they're not going to like that, right? So if you create chaos for other people and yourself, like it just doesn't go well. However, when it comes to good and evil, we're often concerned with regimes and tyrants and government oppression and so on. And interestingly, this kind of works the same way. Okay, so let's say you live in Canada and a tyrannical government enacts harsh decrees. Okay, these laws and practices make life unbearably difficult for many of the citizens, creating chaos for those citizens. In response, those citizens become discontent and begin resisting the government. This leads to protests, trucker convoys, and other disruptions to the government's plans. Okay, so let's say an evil government, okay, tries to, do what it wants to do and just creates chaos for everyone. Okay, there's going to be some pushback, at least from certain members of society. Now, the problem with that is maybe the government gets away with it for a time. However, in addition to dealing with their usual responsibilities, now the government has to deal with protests and disruptions, which costs money, time, and personnel. Okay, and then maybe they have to crack down on those protests, which might create more protests. It's just this downward spiral of entropy. Okay, because the more you try to crack down on people, okay, the more they're not going to like it, the more they're going to resist it. Even if it's just, say, a work to rule strike at a company, right? If you crack down on your employees and they enact work to rule, that creates problems for the company and so on. So as I hope you can see intuitively, when a person or a government creates entropy, that entropy persists in the social system and creates inefficiencies. It creates protests, pushbacks, and so on. Okay? Which, as I'm sure you can probably intuitively realize, makes evil and tyranny inherently unstable. Makes it inherently unstable. Okay, a couple of historical examples of this would be the American Revolution. Okay, on the screen I've got a picture of the Boston Tea Party. They didn't like the tax on tea, so they rebelled. And then, the American Revolution and so on. Britain ended up losing all of the colonies. Okay, and another example, a little bit more recent, would be the fall of the USSR. Okay, so if you think about the USSR in particular, okay, they had an extensive system of gulags, government informants, secret police. The USSR basically did everything it could possibly do to maintain total control over its citizens. And eventually, it just collapsed under its own weight. Okay, when you read the stories about the USSR, like the Soviet whaling program and just how Soviet Russia operated, it was so inefficient because they were working so hard to maintain control. They were just creating like entropy, basically. Okay, and eventually people got so frustrated with it that they overthrew the whole thing. Okay, so even in the case of the USSR with gulags, secret police, government informants, people ratting on their own family members, blah, 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 right? It still failed. And why? Because evil, and which creates entropy, is inherently unstable. It is unstable. Okay, it is not a good long-term strategy because the entropy that evil creates and tyranny creates, the entropy makes the social system unstable and unsustainable. Okay? So the general principle here is that the more entropy a person or organization creates within their social environment, the more work must be done by everyone to keep the social environment cohesive. And at some point, a limit is reached where the social group will rebel or crumble. Okay, so if you are a nasty person on an individual level, eventually, the people around you are going to get sick of you. Okay, if you are a nasty government, eventually, even if you're the USSR, okay, eventually people are going to get sick of the government. Okay, so in this way, evil seems to be inherently unstable. It seems to be inherently unstable. And as far as I can tell, as a physicist, I guess, as far as I can tell, it's because evil creates so much entropy. It creates so much entropy that it makes the social system unstable and unsustainable. And eventually people hit a limit and they start pushing back against it because they don't want to have to deal with all of the entropy that's being created. They don't want to have to be thinking so hard, walking on eggshells, whatever it is. Okay, so evil seems to be inherently unstable. And because it's inherently unstable, that's why it always loses. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is that when you think about good, quote unquote good, good is ordered. Good is stable. Okay? When you are a nice person and you're nice to the people around you, okay, that creates harmony. It creates order. Okay? Let's say like a football team, everyone likes each other, is nice to each other, works well together. Okay, that's ordered. That's low entropy. Okay, as opposed to, say, a football team where there's a bunch of rivalries and people hate each other and blah, blah, blah. There's just more entropy there. There's more chaos, disorder, and so on. And so good is inherently stable. Good is inherently stable. Evil is inherently unstable. Okay, which is why evil might triumph for a time because of the use of force and so on. But it's a short-term strategy because good and stability and order will outlast whatever is going on with evil. Okay? So I don't know if I can talk much more about this at this time. I'd probably just be over-explaining. But I hope this was an interesting, look at good and evil. Okay, when you examine it through the concept of entropy and, order and chaos, I think it's pretty easy to see why evil is just a more chaotic mode of being, okay, for the person involved, people involved, and everyone around them, okay, and that ends up leading to social disorder, protests, pushbacks, and so on, okay, whereas good doesn't have that problem, okay, so, that's why good always seems to win, because it is thermodynamically stable. And evil always seems to lose because it is thermodynamically unstable and unsustainable. So if you like this video, you would probably like my book called Ticket to Heaven, link in description. And you would probably like a lot of the other videos on my channel. So thanks very much for watching, and stay good.